technology. It's not just the big boys that can use and even improve upon these systems. So it means, for example, when Israel went to war with Hezbollah, it didn't go to war against a fellow nation-state military, but that group, that paramilitary/terrorist group, flew 4 drones back at Israel. Another example that's in the book is actually a group of college kids out of Swarthmore wanted to do something about the genocide in Darfur. So they held a fundraiser. It went a lot better than they planned. They actually ended up raising about $500,000, upon which this group of college kids entered into negotiations with a private military company for the rental of drones to deploy to Sudan. They held the negotiations out of their dorm room. What we have here is a cross between robotics and the potential of non-state actors. And this can lead to some dark things. And I think there's 2 trends that are going to come out of this. One is that these systems reinforce the power of individuals and small groups against the state. The second is that they eliminate the culling power of suicide bombing. That is, you don't have to promise a robot that it's going to be received by 70 virgins in heaven to persuade it to blow itself up. And so the future of terrorism may be this cross between Al-Qaeda 2.0 and the next generation version of Timothy McVeigh, both made far more lethal by these technologies. But these ripple effects of war go out into other areas, such as into our own politics. And I thought a former Assistant Secretary of Defense who served for Ronald Reagan put it really well. And this is his quote: "I like these systems because they save lives, but I also worry about more marketization of war, more shock and awe talk to defray discussion of the costs. People are more likely to support the use of force if they view it as costless." And so for me, robots seem to take certain trends that are active in our body politic right now and take them to their final logical ending point. The way to think about this is this way. As you well know, we don't have a draft anymore. We don't declare war anymore. We don't buy war bonds anymore, pay higher taxes for war anymore. And now we have a trend that takes more and more of those who would go into harm's way and replaces them with machines. And so the political consequences of this may be that we are taking the already lowering bars to war in our society and dropping them to the ground. There's a real-world example of this right now. We've carried out more than 50 bomb strikes into Pakistan over the last year and a half. We've carried out the equivalent of the opening week of the Kosovo War, but we don't talk about it. We don't talk about it in our media or politics because it's been done via drones. But the future of war is also going to be a YouTube war. That is, these systems don't just merely remove the human from risk, they record everything that they see. So they don't just de-link the public, they reshape the relationship with war. There's already several thousand video clips of combat footage from Iraq and Afghanistan up online right now on sites like YouTube. Some of it released officially, some of it released unofficially. Now this could arguably be a good thing. You're building links between the home front and the war front that didn't exist before. But we need to remember these technologies, they may sound like science fiction, but they're playing out in our very real, very human, very strange world. So for some people, the ability to download a video clip of combat is turning war into a form of entertainment. The folks deployed in the field have a name for it. They call it war porn or predator porn. And a typical example that I got was an email with a title line that says, "Watch this." Now we all sometimes get emails like that with a little clip attached. And you know, it may be typically someone screwing up on American Idol or a video clip of some nerdy kid dancing in his basement or something like that. In this case, the "watch this" was of a Predator drone strike, Hellfire missile drops, goes in, hits the target, explosion, bodies tossed into the air. It was set to music. It was set to the pop song, "I Just Want to Fly" by the band Sugar Ray. So what we have is the ability to watch more, but experience less when it comes to war. And these clips can be very seductive. It's easy to forget that the violence is real. It's easy to forget that not everyone is fighting from afar. And it also has a warping effect. It's sort of like the difference, I think, of watching a NBA game, a professional basketball game on TV, where the players are these little tiny figures on the screen, versus what it's like to watch that NBA game in person, where you see what someone who's 7 foot tall really does look like, versus the experience of playing in that game yourself and knowing what it's like to be dunked on by KG. But the thing is, you're not even watching the whole game. You're watching the highlight reel. You're watching the ESPN Sports Center version of the war. So all the context, all the training, all the strategy, it all just becomes slam dunks and smart bombs. And so the irony of all this is that while the future of war may involve more and more machines, war is still driven by our human failings. And all these ripple effects are still about our human psychology, our human politics. So we have a policy example of this right now. What are robots' impact on our very real, very human war of ideas that we're fighting against radical groups around the world? That is, what is the message we think we are sending when we use unmanned systems versus what is the message that's being received half a world away? So I went around trying to find out the answer to this question. And one of the people that I interviewed, I think, put it well in terms of our perception. He's a very senior Bush administration official. And he said how our unmanning of war, quote, plays to our strength. The thing that scares people is our technology. But what about when you go ask those people? So one of the people that I asked was the leading newspaper editor of Lebanon. And he's actually saying this while there's a drone flying above him at the time. And this is his quote. "It's just another sign of the cold-hearted, cruel Israelis and Americans who are also cowards because they send out machines to fight us. They don't want to fight us like real men, but they're afraid to fight. So we just have to kill a few of their soldiers to defeat them." Basically, we have a disconnect between message sent in the war of ideas versus message received. Or as one Pentagon analyst put it, quote, "The optics of this look really freaking bad. It makes us look like the evil empire from Star Wars and the other side look like the Rebel Alliance." The future of war, though, involves a new experience of war, a new type of warfare, changing of the meaning of going to war itself. Going to war, that phrase, has meant the same thing for 5,000 years, whether you were talking about the ancient Greeks going to war against Troy, or my grandfather going to war in the Pacific against the Imperial Japanese fleet. It meant that you were going to a place where there was such danger that your family might never see you again. That's what going to war has always meant. But compare that to the experience of a Predator drone pilot. And this is one that I met with talking about what it was like to fight insurgents in Iraq while based in Nevada. You are going to war for 12 hours, shooting weapons at targets, directing kills on enemy combatants. And then you get in the car and you drive home. And within 20 minutes, you're sitting at the dinner table talking to your kids about their homework. This psychological disconnect of being at war and then immediately at home is actually not easy. And we're discovering, in fact, that these units of remote warriors actually have higher levels of combat stress and PTSD than many of the units physically deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. It's also affecting the experience of killing. Quote, "It's like a video game," is how one young pilot described what it was like to take out enemy troops from far. And as anyone who's played Grand Theft Auto knows, there's things that we would do in the virtual world that maybe we wouldn't do in the real world. Much of what you're hearing here is that there's always two sides to every revolution. So for example, while Moore's law is happening with these systems, Murphy's law isn't going away. The fog of war isn't being lifted. The enemy still has a vote. Mistakes still happen. And most importantly, we may be getting incredible capabilities, but we're also experiencing incredible new human dilemmas in everything from our politics to our ethics. Now, some people say, oh, when it doesn't work out with robots, it's just an oops moment. That's what a vice president at a leading military robots company described, that when your robot doesn't work out as planned, it's just an oops moment. But what are oops moments when you're talking about robotics and the military? Sometimes these oops moments are kind of funny, like when, if you remember, you saw the picture of that machine gun armed robot. It looked like a lawnmower, the sword system. When they first tested that out in one demonstration, it went, quote, squirrely. It started spinning in a circle and pointed its machine gun at the reviewing stand of VIPs. They were not amused. Fortunately, there were no bullets in the gun, so no one was hurt. Other times, oops moments can be tragic, like last year in South Africa. An anti-aircraft cannon had a, quote, software glitch, and instead of firing upwards during a training exercise, leveled and fired in a circle. It killed 9 soldiers because of a software glitch. We have new questions of law and ethics. For example, what do you do about unmanned slaughter? That is, what do you do when you kill someone that you didn't intend to kill? Such as the 3 times we thought we got Osama bin Laden with a Predator drone strike, and we got someone else. One case, it was an Afghan civilian who was just unlucky enough to look like Osama bin Laden when viewed through the soda straw of a Predator drone. And that's where we're at now. What happens as we move into systems that are making more and more of their own decisions? And don't believe this isn't coming. Actually, during the book, I came across 4 different Pentagon projects about armed autonomous systems. There you go into new territory. Take the issue of war crimes. Now, you could argue that war crimes might be less likely with robots, because robots are emotionless. Robots don't care if their buddy gets killed. They don't commit a crime of revenge or rage, which is how a lot of war crimes happen. But robots are emotionless. They don't have a sense of empathy, a sense of guilt. A robot looks at an 80-year-old grandmother in a wheelchair the same way they look at a T-80 tank. They're both just zeros and ones in the programming language. And so this poses a question, which is, how do we catch up our 20th century laws of war that are so old right now they qualify for Medicare to these 21st century technologies like the Predator Reaper drone that, oh, by the way, are applied against enemies that know these laws and are trying to use and abuse them. So it's not just you're flying a Predator drone, but it's also going against an enemy that sees a school as not something you should avoid, but what you should base yourself out of. And we don't have good answers to this right now. And actually, I remember there's a scene in the book that's a great illustration of this, where I asked about a situation where one of our drones had accidentally killed the wrong people. And this was at Human Rights Watch. And 2 of the senior leaders there got in an argument in front of me about which system of law we should turn to. One of the senior leaders at Human Rights Watch argued that we should turn to the Geneva Conventions. The other one argued that we should turn to the Star Trek Prime Directive for guidance. Now, that's the irony here, is that in many cases, when people do talk about robotics and ethics, it immediately goes to science fiction. And in fact, the science fiction usually isn't Star Trek. It's almost always Isaac Asimov, the famous 3 laws of robotics. And if you don't know these, they're pretty simple. Law 1 is a robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. Law 2 is the idea that, quote, a robot must obey orders given to it by human beings except where such orders would conflict with law number 1. And finally, there's law 3. A robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection doesn't conflict with the first or second law. And later on in these stories, Asimov adds the 0th law, which comes above all others, and it argues that, quote, a robot may not harm humanity or by its inaction allow humanity to come to harm. Now, the interesting thing is whenever you meet with any roboticist, they can say those laws almost by heart. And when you open conversations about ethics, it always goes to these 3 laws. There's a problem, though. The first is, these laws are fiction. Isaac Asimov wrote them as a plot device. And in fact, in all of Asimov's stories, they're about how robots following these laws end up still getting into trouble and causing harm. And, in fact, the poster for the 2004 movie, starring the Fresh Prince again, put it best. Quote, rules were made to be broken. There's a second problem with these laws. No technology can yet replicate them inside our machine.